Good evening. Today I'm going to talk about the Transfiguration, an incident recorded in Matthew chapter 17, beginning at verse 1. The incident runs as follows. Jesus takes a few of his followers, the closest ones, Peter, James and John, up an unspecified mountain, and suddenly they see that he is transfigured, as the word has it. He is shining bright, and his face is lit up, and he's seen conversing with Moses and Elijah, who suddenly appear. Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the great prophet of Israel. A cloud descends, and from the cloud comes a voice proclaiming Jesus as God's beloved Son, echoing the words that Jesus heard at his baptism, with the addition that Jesus' followers are told to listen to him. In this extraordinary experience, Peter in particular is completely bewildered and suddenly suggests that tabernacles, booths or tents, recalling the wanderings of Israel in the desert in the Old Testament, should be established, should be built. Jesus ignores him and the vision passes, and there they are left with Jesus alone. He reassures them in their fear because they're quite terrified by this extraordinary experience, and then they go down the mountain. Now, the first thing to realise about this extraordinary story is that it was written well within living memory of the events it describes. However, it also recalls a much older story, one from the Old Testament found in the book of Exodus, the giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 24, beginning at verse 12. It even has God speaking from a cloud, the cloud that both conceals God's presence and reveals that he's there. And Moses, when he returns from the mountain, down the mountain, many chapters later as it happens, his face, like Jesus's, is shining. Moses also goes up the mountain with companions, as in Matthew's story. Now, what are we to make of this? When you read about it in commentaries, it quite understandably often says that this story, the story of the Transfiguration, is meant to recall the story in the book of Exodus. Well, what does this mean? Does this mean that Matthew or somebody else has completely made it up to make some symbolic points? Or did it happen exactly as described in Matthew's Gospel, or what? Or are we to go to the other extreme and just say that it's a complete load of superstitious nonsense? It's the sort of rantings that religious people characteristically engage in, where they claim to have seen visions of divine beings and so on and so forth. But I think there is a way through all these various possibilities which holds on to the objective truth of what happened, while also recognising its relation to certain characteristics of the wider phenomenon of religious experience, which is extremely common to all people in all cultures. If you want to dismiss all such experiences as totally impossible because there is no transcendent world of which one can sometimes become aware, and there is no God, the world is, as it were, a completely closed system with only the observable being true, then you will have to reject all religious experiences as hallucinations, some sort of misunderstanding, or even fraud, or even signs of mental instability. But I would suggest that this is, strictly speaking, a prejudgment and therefore a prejudice. Religious experiences are extremely widespread over history and even today, and they are undergone by people who in all other respects may seem to be perfectly sane, intelligent and honest in the reportage of what has happened to them. There are, of course, people who are delusional, and there are fakes as well, but there are enough people who have religious experiences who in all other respects appear to be honest, which raises the possibility that they really have experienced something that was really there. Maybe it is the case that at times the veil, as it were, between normal daily life, the middle distance experience of middle-sized beings in a middle-sized world, that veil is drawn back and we see beyond it to something else, some deeper meaning as to what really may be going on behind the scenes. And I think this is what is supposed to be happening in the story of the Transfiguration. The daily experience of encountering Jesus is suddenly set aside and something deeper is revealed. But did it really happen? Or is it just constructed on the basis of memories of reading about and praying about and experiencing what happened in the Old Testament, the story of the revelation of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai? I don't think that is necessarily the case. Let's try looking at it another way. When anybody experiences something special, something very important, they experience it in a certain way. They recognise certain features, and then they shape those features into how they're going to communicate it to others. So there's the original experience, there is their interpretation of it, and then there's how they communicate it. And at all these levels there is going to be some shaping going on, and that doesn't mean that the experience didn't really happen. I'm quite prepared to believe that Jesus and his companions really did go up a mountain, and that his companions did really undergo some extraordinary and life-changing experience. But it is also not surprising that they interpreted this experience in the light of their memories of what they had read and studied in the Old Testament, the book of the law, in which they would have been imbued from their childhood upwards. And so we can't recapture what that experience actually was. That experience was private to the people who had it. All we have is how they communicated it. And in their communication of it, certain important features arise, certain pieces of symbolism which I think are crucial to our understanding of what Jesus was all about. He is seen conversing with Moses and Elijah, so he's being related to the great lawgiver Moses and the great prophet Elijah. He is seen conversing with them on equal terms, so he is at least as significant as they are. The voice from the cloud, however one is to understand this, is also extremely significant. And I think we should try to put aside trying to imagine what it must have been like. We must accept the interpretation given by the people who actually underwent it. For a modern person, thinking of God actually speaking audibly out of a cloud is likely to be absurd. This is the stuff of cartoons, this is the stuff of Monty Python. But we can believe that something actually happened that was interpreted in a certain way. And what was understood by the voice is extremely important. This voice is not giving a new law, as the voice gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. This voice is affirming Jesus as the intermediary, if you like, or certainly the transmitter of God's own purposes and perhaps God's own nature too. This is my beloved Son. A closer relationship cannot be contemplated. Listen to him. Jesus will speak and act with God's authority. And what of Peter's bewildered desire and suggestion to make tabernacles in which they can dwell? It is good for us to be here. I wonder what is meant by that. Maybe it is an attempt to bind an experience, to make it permanent, to make it fixed and established. And one of the things that people who have experiences of God are very clear about is that they are fleeting. They are not things you can seek, they're not things you can bind, they're not things you can establish by building things around them. You have to expect them unbidden, and you have to accept that when they have been experienced, they will go. They are essentially fleeting, they're essentially something that is coming from beyond. They're not something you can do anything about, that you can generate or construct or make a creation of your own. You just have to accept them for what they are. And maybe this is something that Peter has to learn when his suggestion that they make tabernacles is simply ignored. And yet Jesus also speaks to his followers graciously. They are understandably terrified by this extraordinary experience of the transcendent, and he bids them not to be afraid as they return down the mountainside. But there is yet something more significant in this story. If you look at the passages either side of it, you'll notice that it's sandwiched between prophecies of Jesus' passion and death. And I think this is extremely important and lies at the heart of what the Transfiguration is all about and why Matthew places it precisely there in his Gospel. The glory that is revealed on Mount Sinai is a transcendent glory. It is an imperious glory. God is giving the law by which the people of Israel are to live the halakhic way of life, walking with God and walking in his ways. God is represented as communicating himself through thunder and lightning, through dramatic phenomena. This is a glorious, majestic God. But in what does the glory of God seen in Jesus consist? It is simply depicted, and without remainder, as a glory that is seen on the cross, in a self-sacrificial death, prefaced by the loving graciousness that is seen in Jesus' words to his followers as he reassures them not to be afraid. And the new thing that is revealed therefore about God is not an imperious majesty, but a glory that is seen through love, and a glory that is seen through, without remainder, a self-sacrificial death, Jesus' death on the cross. He comes down from the mountain, and the glory to which he goes is his passion in Jerusalem, where he will be arrested and cruelly killed. And in that we see God's glory, and in no other way. And so the Transfiguration contains within it a prophecy of the Passion. It is God's glory not seen in imperious majesty, but in the way of self-giving love and a self-sacrificial death on the cross.